Imagine yourself deep inside an old, abandoned mine, the dark tunnels echoing your own breaths, but that's not all you hear. Chains dragging across the floor, a creature lurking in the shadows. You and your friends came in search of treasure, but now you're fighting for your lives. This is the terror awaiting you in this chilling story of treasure hunters, where every step could be your last. If you're a fan of horror and suspense, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share this video with your friends and comment below which country and city you're watching from. Get ready, the creature is watching. The sky over the Scottish Highlands was a muted grey, the kind of sky that promised rain but never quite delivered. Duncan MacLeod inhaled deeply, the damp, earthy scent of the hills filling his lungs as he stood before the entrance of Glenmore Mine. It had been abandoned for over 50 years, the rusty sign above the entrance barely legible, its warning to trespassers long eroded by time. He glanced at his two companions, Angus and Ewan, before switching on his headlamp, the beam cutting into the oppressive darkness of the mine's mouth. "You sure about this?" Ewan asked, his voice betraying a mix of excitement and apprehension. His gaze flitted to the crumbling stone pillars framing the entrance, the once sturdy wooden beams now bowed and splintered. Duncan nodded, his expression hard. "We've come this far, lad. No turning back now. If the old miners' tales are true, there's still good money buried down here. But we'll need to be quick, this place is barely standing as it is." The interior of the mine was colder than outside, the temperature dropping sharply as they moved further from the entrance. The air was stale, thick with the weight of decades of neglect, dust swirling in the beams of their lamps. Every step they took echoed unnervingly, the sound bouncing back at them from unseen recesses of the cave. The floor beneath their boots was uneven, scattered with loose gravel and ancient debris left by long-dead miners. Angus, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a beard streaked with gray, adjusted the strap of his heavy backpack, the weight of their tools pulling on his shoulders. "You ever wonder why no one's come back for this place? Why it's still abandoned after all these years?" Duncan smirked, though there was little humor in it. "Folks around here are a superstitious lot. Talk of spirits, bad omens. They say the mine was cursed, but what does it matter? It's just stone and iron down here. What's to fear?" Ewan, the youngest of the group, swallowed hard but didn't reply. He'd heard the stories growing up, of strange sounds, of entire crews disappearing without a trace. Even now, the thought of the cold earth closing in on them made him feel like the walls were breathing, as if they were being swallowed by something alive. The deeper they ventured, the more the mine seemed to press in on them. The beams above their heads sagged under the weight of the earth, and cracks ran through the walls, some of them oozing with moisture. In places, the wood was rotted, the smell of mildew overpowering. Duncan led the way, his steps confident, though his grip on the flashlight tightened with each passing minute. They came to a narrow passage, barely wide enough for one man to squeeze through. "This should take us to the lower levels," Duncan said, gesturing for Angus to follow behind him. "If there's anything left of value, it'll be down there." But as Duncan stepped forward, the ground beneath him groaned. Before he could react, the earth gave way. There was a deafening crack, followed by the sound of crumbling rock. In an instant, the floor collapsed under his feet, and Duncan felt himself plunge into the darkness below. "Duncan!" Angus shouted, his voice raw with panic as he dropped to his knees, reaching out to where his friend had been moments ago. But there was nothing, only a gaping hole where the floor had been. Dust and debris filled the air, making it hard to breathe, and the sound of tumbling stones echoed down into the abyss. Duncan's world was chaos. His body slammed into jagged rocks as he fell, the impact jarring him, but before he could register the pain, cold, rushing water engulfed him. His breath was knocked from his lungs as he was dragged into a submerged tunnel, the icy river pulling him deeper into the earth. The shock of the cold was like 1,000 needles piercing his skin, numbing his limbs almost instantly. Above, Angus and Ewan scrambled to the edge of the hole, shining their lights into the depths. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, only catching glimpses of jagged stone walls and the faint glimmer of water far below. "We need to get him out." Ewan's voice was shaking as he yanked off his belt, desperate to fashion something that could reach Duncan. But the drop was too far, and the belt wasn't nearly long enough. "Think, damn it!" Angus growled, scanning the narrow tunnel for anything they could use. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the knowledge that every second counted. The old mine was unstable, and the more they moved, the more they risked a full collapse. Meanwhile, Duncan was fighting for his life. The water was relentless, dragging him down with merciless force. He kicked, thrashed, and clawed at the slick rock walls, trying to find purchase, but his fingers slipped over the smooth, wet stone. He could feel the current pulling him deeper into the mine, the tunnel narrowing around him. The freezing water burned his lungs as he gasped for air between violent surges of the current. His flashlight had been ripped from his helmet in the fall, and now there was nothing but darkness. Absolute, oppressive darkness. He couldn't tell which way was up or down, the roar of the water drowning out his own thoughts. Panic clawed at his mind, and for the first time, Duncan felt the real possibility of death creeping in. But then, through the cacophony of rushing water, he heard something else. A metallic clang, faint but unmistakable. It echoed through the tunnel, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the sound of falling rocks or shifting earth, it was deliberate, like the dragging of metal across stone. Duncan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it a hallucination brought on by fear and cold? Or was there something else down here, deep in the bowels of the earth, something waiting? As the darkness pressed in on him, Duncan could feel the weight of the mine closing around him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he would ever see daylight again. The echo of the metallic clang faded, leaving only the relentless rush of water and the suffocating blackness. Duncan strained to focus, his body fighting the icy current that pulled him further into the depths of the mine. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that sound wasn't far off, something metallic scraping against the stone, like ancient chains dragging along the walls. His lungs burned, his fingers raw from clawing at the wet stone. With each second, the current tugged harder, making it impossible to hold on to anything for long. His thoughts blurred between survival and dread, he was running out of time. Above ground, Angus and Ewan were frantic. The jagged hole Duncan had fallen through was far too deep, and their makeshift rope, a belt tied to a branch, dangled uselessly into the dark abyss. Damn it! Angus slammed his fist into the ground, frustration boiling over. His mind raced, knowing the longer they took to act, the less chance Duncan had. There's got to be something we can use, anything. Ewan, still shaking with panic, scanned their gear, which was woefully inadequate for a situation like this. We didn't bring ropes for a bloody expedition, we weren't expecting this. The mine groaned around them. Small rocks tumbled from the ceiling, as if the cave itself was warning them to leave. Ewan's breath hitched. He could feel the air growing thicker, the mine's tension building. The ground beneath their feet felt less stable by the minute. We're losing him. Ewan shouted, his voice cracking. We've got to. A sudden noise cut him off. A distant, echoing clang, barely audible over the rumble of the mine. It wasn't the sound of falling debris, it was deliberate. Both men froze, their eyes meeting in confusion. Angus's face hardened. What was that? Ewan whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder might provoke the mine itself. I don't know, Angus replied, his voice low, but his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. But it didn't sound natural. Underscore 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 underscore. Far below, Duncan's situation had grown worse. His muscles screamed from exertion, and his mind teetered on the edge of exhaustion. The water's frigid grip seemed to sap the strength from his bones, his movements sluggish as he fought to stay afloat. The tunnel had narrowed, the current forcing him into a bottleneck where the water surged even faster. He was running out of options. And then he saw it. A dim light, flickering in the distance. At first, Duncan thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was impossible. His flashlight had been lost in the fall, and his friends were far above, too high for their lights to reach this far down. But the light was there, unmistakably. It wavered, like a candle flame dancing in the wind, faint but persistent. Duncan's breath caught in his throat. Someone else was down here. Or something. Using the last of his strength, he pushed against the current, trying to steer himself toward the source of the light. It was his only chance. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop, but he forced himself forward, the water battering him from all sides. As he drew closer, the light grew stronger, casting eerie reflections on the walls of the tunnel. Just as he thought he was nearing the source, the light vanished. Extinguished in an instant, leaving Duncan in total darkness once again. A moment later, something brushed against his leg. It wasn't the current, it was solid. Cold. And it moved with purpose. Duncan's heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen in the icy water. He couldn't see what it was, but he could feel it moving below the surface, circling him like a predator testing its prey. He kicked wildly, trying to push away from it, but the tunnel was too narrow, the current too strong. Panic set in, his breathing ragged as the weight of the water pressed down on him. A hand. Cold as stone, rough, and unnatural, it wrapped around his ankle. Duncan screamed, thrashing violently, but the grip was ironclad. The unseen force yanked him beneath the surface, dragging him down into the black water. He fought, his lungs burning for air as he was pulled deeper into the mine's unseen depths. His vision blurred, consciousness fading as the cold overtook him. In his final moments of clarity, he heard it again, the metallic clang, louder this time, as if it was right beside him. Underscore 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 underscore. Back at the surface, Angus and Ewan had managed to fashion a crude pulley system with what little they had. Angus gripped the makeshift rope, lowering it into the hole. "Duncan," he shouted. "Grab hold, man. We're bringing you up." There was no response. Only the endless sound of rushing water. Ewan's face was pale, his hands shaking as he held the rope. He's not answering. Angus's jaw clenched. "Lower it farther. He's down there, we just need to reach him." The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low rumble that sent more stones tumbling from the ceiling. The mine was unstable, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before the whole place came down on them. Just as they were about to give up hope, there was a sharp tug on the rope. Angus and Ewan exchanged a look of shock. "He's got it!" Ewan shouted, gripping the rope tighter. "Pull, pull!" Angus grunted, his muscles straining as they began to hoist the rope back up. The weight was heavy, far heavier than they expected. But they didn't question it, they pulled with every ounce of strength they had, desperate to save their friend. As they neared the surface, Angus leaned over the edge of the hole, peering into the darkness below. "Almost there, mate, just a bit further." Suddenly, the rope went slack. Angus stumbled back, the weight of the sudden release knocking him off balance. Ewan cried out in surprise, clutching the limp rope in disbelief. "Duncan?" Angus's voice was barely a whisper, but there was no answer. No sound. No movement. The silence was deafening. The oppressive silence hung in the air like a noose, tightening around Angus and Ewan as they stared at the limp rope. The pit below, which had moments ago felt like a lifeline, now seemed a yawning chasm of doom. Ewan's hands trembled violently, still clutching the rope, as if refusing to let go might somehow bring Duncan back from the depths. "Duncan!" Angus shouted again, his voice raw, cracking in the dead air. There was no response. His eyes darted to Ewan, who stood pale as a ghost, frozen in place. "We need to go down there." He could still be. But even as he said it, Angus knew something was terribly wrong. The weight they had been pulling, the way the rope had suddenly gone slack, it all felt wrong. Duncan was no lightweight, and the sensation just before the rope had loosened wasn't just the absence of weight, it had felt as though something had let go. "Angus, what if he's—" Ewan's voice wavered, his wide eyes darting toward the pit. He didn't dare finish the sentence, but the unspoken words hung between them, thick with dread. Angus's mind raced, battling against his growing fear. There was no way Duncan could have simply slipped, not with the weight and the resistance they had felt. Something had been down there with him. He looked at Ewan, his expression hardening. "We're not leaving without him. You hear me?" Ewan nodded shakily, though every instinct in his body was screaming for him to run, to leave this cursed mine behind. But the bond of loyalty, of friendship, held him in place, even as his gut churned with unease. Angus scanned their surroundings. The tunnel groaned softly, a reminder of how unstable the ground was beneath their feet. Time was running out. He grabbed the flashlight from his belt and strapped it more tightly to his helmet. "We're going down," he said, his voice a mixture of determination and fear. "Tie off the rope to that support beam. We'll lower ourselves down, together." Ewan's heart raced, but he moved quickly, hands shaking as he secured the rope to a rusted beam nearby. The support creaked under the strain, but it held. Once it was fastened, Angus grabbed the rope and gave it a firm tug. "It'll hold. Let's move." Angus descended first, the narrow walls of the pit pressing in as he lowered himself into the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper he went, the smell of wet earth and decay thick in his nostrils. Each footstep echoed faintly, swallowed by the abyss. Ewan followed close behind, his knuckles white as he gripped the rope. When they finally reached the bottom, the darkness was absolute. Their headlamps flickered across the waterlogged tunnel, revealing jagged rocks and debris, but there was no sign of Duncan. The underground river gurgled softly nearby, its black surface glinting under the weak light of their lamps. "Duncan!" Angus shouted again, his voice bouncing off the stone walls, but it came back to him as nothing more than a hollow whisper. They moved further along the narrow passage, the wet ground sucking at their boots as they scanned every inch of the cave floor. The current of the underground river was stronger here, pulling debris and silt toward a deeper, unseen part of the tunnel. If Duncan had been dragged by the current, there was no telling how far he could have been swept away. Ewan's voice shook. "Angus, look." Angus turned his head to where Ewan was pointing. There, on the ground near the water's edge, was Duncan's flashlight, cracked and covered in mud. It was flickering weakly, its battery almost drained. Damn it. Angus knelt down, picking it up. He could feel the tension rising in his chest. There was no sign of Duncan, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had vanished. Angus swept his flashlight toward the water, the beam cutting through the gloom, but what it revealed chilled him to the core. Along the wet stone walls, faint but unmistakable, were scratch marks. Long, deep grooves, as if something had been dragged across the rock. Angus's heart pounded in his ears as he traced the marks with his eyes. They led deeper into the tunnel, vanishing into the black water. Ewan stepped back, his face pale. What did that? Those marks, they're not from Duncan." Angus didn't respond. His mouth was dry, his stomach twisted in knots. He wanted to say it was just the rock shifting, maybe debris from the collapse. But deep down, he knew better. Those marks were deliberate. They were made by something that had been down here, watching. The metallic sound echoed again, louder this time, as if it came from just beyond the bend in the tunnel. It reverberated off the walls, a slow, scraping noise that chilled the blood in their veins. "What the hell is that?" Ewan whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Angus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave Duncan and run. But they were too far in now. And whatever had made that sound was closer than they had realized. Suddenly, the water surged, a ripple that moved unnaturally fast toward them. Both men froze, their flashlights darting toward the dark current. For a split second, something moved beneath the surface. A shadow. Something large. Angus took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "We need to move. Now." But before they could take another step, the water exploded. Something lunged from the depths, a mass of pale, glistening flesh. It was too fast to see clearly, but its form was monstrous, a tangled mess of limbs and sinew, and at its core, the glint of metal. Chains. Rusted, heavy chains that clinked as they moved, dragging along with it. Ewan screamed, stumbling back as the thing surged forward. Angus reacted on instinct, grabbing Ewan by the arm and pulling him back toward the pit they had descended from. His flashlight beam danced wildly across the walls as they ran, the monstrous form crashing through the water behind them, its chains scraping along the stone. They reached the pit just as the tunnel trembled again, another small cave-in sending dust and pebbles raining down on them. Angus grabbed the rope, pushing Ewan up first. "Hurry! Climb!" Angus shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of chains scraping ever closer. Ewan scrambled up the rope, his hands slipping on the wet surface, but fear propelled him upward. Angus followed close behind, glancing down only once. The thing was at the base of the pit now, its pale form writhing in the shadows, those rusted chains clinking like an executioner's blade being sharpened. With one final pull, they hauled themselves out of the pit and collapsed on the stone floor above, gasping for breath. But the tunnel was silent again. The thing had not followed them up. For now. Angus and Ewan lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, gasping for air, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence of the tunnel above was almost more unsettling than the chaos below. Only moments ago, they had been scrambling to escape that thing. Now, as they lay in the dim light of their flickering headlamps, the vast emptiness of the mine seemed to close in on them. Ewan rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. What the hell was that? His voice was barely more than a whisper, cracked and trembling. "Did you see it? That thing?" "It wasn't," he stopped, unable to find the words. Angus sat up slowly, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. The chains. That twisted, unnatural form. He had seen strange things in the wilderness before, but nothing like this. He didn't know how to explain it, and perhaps more terrifyingly, he wasn't sure he wanted to. "I don't know," Angus finally said, his voice rough, but steady. "But we need to get out of here." Ewan's eyes were wide, panic still gripping him. "What about Duncan? We can't just leave him down there." Angus cut him off, his voice hard. "Duncan's gone." He didn't want to say it, didn't want to admit that their friend, the man who had led them into this cursed place, was lost. But deep down, he knew it was true. Whatever had grabbed Duncan had dragged him into the depths, and there was no bringing him back from that. Ewan sat up, shaking his head in disbelief. We don't know that. Maybe he's still alive. We didn't even." Angus grabbed Ewan by the shoulder, his grip firm. "He's gone, lad. We barely made it out ourselves. If we go back down there, we'll end up like him. We need to leave. Now." Ewan looked at Angus, his face pale and drawn. The reality of the situation was sinking in, but it was hard to accept. He swallowed hard, his eyes filling with fear and desperation. But what if? Before he could finish, the ground trembled again, the soft rumble of the mine's instability reminding them that time was running out. Small rocks fell from the ceiling, skittering across the floor like an ominous warning. Angus stood up, adjusting the straps of his backpack. "We don't have time to argue. The whole place is coming down. If we don't get out now, we'll be buried alive." Ewan hesitated, but the fear of being trapped in the collapsing mine overpowered his desperation. He nodded, rising to his feet, though his legs felt weak beneath him. The thought of leaving Duncan behind gnawed at him, but deep down, he knew Angus was right. As they started moving back toward the mine's entrance, the oppressive weight of the dark, twisting tunnels bore down on them. Every step echoed ominously, as if the mine itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to finally swallow them whole. The beam from their flashlights seemed weaker now, flickering as though struggling to penetrate the thick shadows that clung to the walls. Angus kept his eyes forward, moving quickly but cautiously, his mind racing. He had seen the marks on the walls, the chains that had dragged across the stone. Whatever had taken Duncan was not natural, and it wasn't finished with them. The further they walked, the more certain he became that they were being followed. His instincts, honed from years of hunting, told him there was something just beyond their light, watching, waiting. Ewan trailed behind, his nerves on edge, flinching at every sound. The soft drip of water from the ceiling, the creak of the ancient wooden supports, every noise seemed amplified, distorted, as if the mine itself were whispering in the darkness. His mind kept going back to the thing they had seen. Pale, twisted, its chains dragging across the stone like the ghost of some long-dead prisoner. The image wouldn't leave him. After what felt like an eternity, the narrow passageway began to open up. Angus could see the faintest glimmer of light ahead, the entrance to the mine. A rush of relief surged through him. They were almost out. But even as they drew closer to the exit, something in the air shifted. A chill. Not the natural cold of the underground, but something deeper, more malignant. Angus stopped in his tracks, his body going rigid. Ewan, who had been walking a few steps behind, nearly collided with him. "What is it?" Ewan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Angus didn't answer. His eyes scanned the darkness behind them, his flashlight flickering erratically. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something in the tunnel behind them. A sound broke the silence. Soft at first, then louder, the unmistakable clink of metal dragging across stone. Ewan's breath hitched, his eyes widening in terror. It's coming." Angus didn't waste a second. "Run." They bolted toward the entrance, the beam of their flashlights bouncing wildly off the walls as they ran. The metallic scraping grew louder, faster, echoing through the tunnel like a death knell. Ewan's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep up, his mind consumed by panic. The exit was so close, they could see the faint daylight streaming in from the outside world, so tantalizingly close. But behind them, the thing was gaining. Angus could feel it, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing in on them. His legs burned as he pushed harder, his pulse pounding in his ears. As they neared the mouth of the mine, something cold and wet brushed against the back of Ewan's neck. He let out a strangled scream, stumbling forward, his heart leaping into his throat. The chains. They were reaching for him. "Don't stop!" Angus shouted, grabbing Ewan by the arm and pulling him forward with all his strength. They burst out of the mine, the daylight hitting their faces like a sudden, blinding force. Both men collapsed onto the grass outside, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. For a moment, the world was still. The soft whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a bird, it all seemed impossibly normal, impossibly calm compared to the horror they had just escaped. Angus lay on his back, staring up at the gray sky, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Ewan lay beside him, his hands still shaking uncontrollably. But the silence didn't last. From deep within the mine, that same metallic clinking sound echoed faintly out into the daylight. It was distant, but unmistakable. Whatever had been in the mine was still there. And it wasn't finished. The wind swept over the Scottish Highlands, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and heather. The pale daylight, filtered through heavy clouds, felt unreal to Angus and Ewan as they lay on the grass outside Glenmore Mine. The world outside seemed too calm, too peaceful after the nightmare they had just escaped. But neither man felt safe. Angus sat up slowly, his muscles still burning from the frantic escape, his pulse racing in his ears. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He stared back at the dark maw of the mine, half expecting to see something emerge, something pale and twisted dragging its chains across the rocks. But the entrance remained empty, the darkness within unmoving. Silent, but only just. Ewan was still lying on his back, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. His eyes were unfocused, staring up at the sky as if he were somewhere else entirely, lost in the chaos of his thoughts. That thing. Ewan muttered, barely audible. What was it, Angus? It wasn't real, it couldn't be. Angus shook his head, though the image of the creature was seared into his mind. The unnatural form, the clinking of rusted chains, the way it had moved through the water as if it was something ancient, something forgotten. He didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for certain, they had barely escaped with their lives. I don't know, Angus admitted, his voice low and hoarse. But we're not going back in there. Ewan blinked, as if snapping back to reality, and turned to look at him. What about Duncan? His voice cracked, and the weight of the words hung between them like a heavy fog. We can't just leave him. Angus clenched his jaw. The thought of leaving Duncan behind, of abandoning him to whatever haunted those tunnels, gnawed at him. But the truth was, Duncan was gone. No man could survive that, not after being dragged under the water, not after what they'd seen. Duncan's gone, Angus said firmly, his voice rough but resolute. Whatever took him, it wasn't human. And we're no use to him dead. Ewan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes, but he didn't argue. The reality was too overwhelming to deny. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their loss settling over them like a suffocating blanket. The clink of metal echoed faintly from the mine's entrance, almost inaudible, but both men heard it. They froze, eyes locked on the black hole in the earth. It was distant, but unmistakable, the dragging of chains, as if the thing in the mine was still moving, still searching. Angus stood, his legs shaking as he forced himself upright. We need to leave. Now. Ewan slowly got to his feet, his entire body trembling. Where are we going to go? We can't just walk back like nothing happened. We'll head to the village, Angus said, scanning the surrounding hills. The path they had taken to the mine was long, winding through the rugged landscape, and the sky was already darkening, the threat of rain heavy in the air. We'll find help. We'll tell them what happened. Maybe, he paused, realizing how insane the words sounded even as they formed in his mind. Maybe someone will believe us. Ewan's eyes flickered with doubt. Who's going to believe us? You think anyone's going to listen to a story about he hesitated, glancing back at the mine's entrance. A monster? Angus didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue, and deep down, he knew Ewan was right. The villagers wouldn't believe them. Who would? They would write them off as lunatics, claim that Duncan had gotten lost, that they were all suffering from shock. But they didn't have any other choice. As they began walking, the air grew colder, and the wind picked up, biting through their clothes. The rolling hills stretched endlessly before them, dotted with patches of heather and jagged rocks. The village was at least 2 hours away on foot, and with the daylight fading, they had to move quickly if they wanted to make it before nightfall. The silence between them grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of the wind sweeping across the moors. Ewan kept glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear, as if expecting the creature to appear behind them, to rise from the depths and follow them across the hills. After nearly an hour of walking, Angus finally broke the silence. We should have never come here, he muttered, more to himself than to Ewan. Ewan, who had been lost in his own thoughts, glanced at him. What do you mean? Angus's face darkened. The stories about Glenmore Mine. We should have listened to them. My grandfather used to talk about this place, about how it wasn't just the collapses that killed the miners. There were other things, things they never talked about in public. People would disappear. Whole crews would go missing down there. Ewan's eyes widened. You knew about that and you still came? Angus nodded grimly. I didn't believe it. Thought it was just old folk tales. But now... His voice trailed off, and the unspoken truth hung in the air between them. There was something evil in that mine, something far older than the stories. Suddenly, the wind died, and with it, all sounds seemed to vanish from the landscape. Angus stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing. It was too quiet. Not even the birds called from the trees. Ewan noticed it too, his body tensing as he looked around. Angus, Ewan's voice was a whisper, barely audible. Do you hear that? A faint clinking, barely noticeable at first, carried on the breeze. It was distant, but unmistakable. Chains. Dragging across the stone. Ewan's face drained of color, his breath catching in his throat. It's following us. Angus's blood ran cold. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew it was true. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't bound to the mine. It had followed them. And now it was coming for them. Without a word, they broke into a run, the rough terrain making it difficult to keep their footing. The wind howled around them, but the sound of the chains grew louder, closer. Angus's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Ewan stumbled behind him, his eyes wide with terror. The clinking sound echoed again, closer now, as if it were right behind them. Run! Angus shouted, grabbing Ewan by the arm and pulling him along as they sprinted over the uneven ground. The village was still far off, the lights just barely visible through the thickening mist that clung to the hills. But they had to make it. They had to keep going. Behind them, in the gathering gloom, the chains clinked and rattled, like a harbinger of death drawing ever nearer. The clinking of chains seemed to echo inside Angus's skull as he ran, his boots slamming against the uneven ground of the highlands. His lungs burned with each gasp of the cold, damp air, but he didn't dare slow down. Ewan was right behind him, stumbling and gasping, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his face pale with terror. The mist that clung to the hills was thickening, making it harder to see, as if the world itself were closing in around them. Angus kept his eyes fixed on the faint lights of the village ahead, barely visible through the swirling fog. Each step felt like a lifetime, every moment weighed down by the knowledge that the thing was behind them, dragging its chains across the earth. He could hear it now, closer than before, its metal links scraping over the stone and dirt, the sound so sharp and unnatural it made his skin crawl. Keep moving! Angus yelled, his voice hoarse, barely carrying over the howling wind. Ewan didn't reply, but Angus could hear him struggling, his breath coming in harsh gasps. He glanced back, and his heart skipped a beat. Ewan was faltering, his legs shaking beneath him, his face twisted in pain and exhaustion. He was barely keeping up, and the fear in his eyes told Angus what they both knew: Ewan couldn't run much longer. Angus slowed just enough to grab Ewan's arm, yanking him forward. Come on, mate. We're almost there. Ewan stumbled, nearly falling, but Angus pulled him upright. They were so close, the village was just over the next rise. The soft glow of lanterns was their only lifeline in the dark, and the promise of safety was all that kept Angus's legs moving. But the chains were louder now. Closer. He could almost feel the presence behind them, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to drain the warmth from the air, leaving a freezing chill in its wake. Ewan gasped, his legs finally giving out beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he clawed at the earth, trying to pull himself forward. Angus, he panted, his voice barely a whisper. I can't. I can't. Angus stopped, his mind racing. He couldn't leave Ewan behind. Not after everything they'd been through. But the creature, whatever it was coming. The clinking of its chains was deafening now, as if it were right behind them, just out of sight. Angus dropped to his knees, grabbing Ewan by the collar of his jacket and dragging him forward. Get up, damn it. We have to keep moving. Ewan groaned, his body trembling with exhaustion. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out again, his face pale as a ghost. Angus's heart pounded in his chest as he looked back, the mist swirling behind them like a living thing, hiding whatever horrors lay within. And then, through the fog, he saw it. A pale figure. Vaguely human, but twisted, its limbs elongated and wrong, dragging behind it rusted chains that clinked with every step. Its skin was ashen, like something long dead, its face obscured by shadows. But its eyes, glowing faintly in the mist, were fixed on them with a hunger that froze Angus's blood. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, the noise sending shivers down Angus's spine. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its chains scraping and rattling as it advanced. There was no escape. Angus, Ewan's voice was barely audible, thick with fear. He had seen it too. Angus's grip tightened on Ewan's jacket, pulling him upright with sheer force of will. "We're not dying here," he growled, his voice filled with a mix of terror and determination. He heaved Ewan to his feet, the younger man leaning heavily against him as they staggered forward, the lights of the village now just a few hundred yards away. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet as they ran, the mist thickening around them, making the world feel unreal, like they were trapped in some terrible nightmare. The creature was gaining on them, its chains clinking faster, louder. Angus didn't dare look back again, he could feel its presence pressing down on them, suffocating in its intensity. They reached the crest of the hill, and for a moment, Angus felt a flicker of hope. The village was right there, just below them. Safety. Shelter. People who might be able to help. But that flicker was short-lived. Ewan screamed. Angus spun around just in time to see the chains lash out from the mist, wrapping around Ewan's ankle. The younger man's face twisted in horror as the iron links tightened, pulling him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him, his eyes wide with terror as he was dragged backward toward the creature. "Ewan!" Angus shouted, lunging forward and grabbing Ewan's arms, pulling with all his strength. But the creature was stronger. Far stronger. Ewan's scream was cut short as the chains tightened around his legs, pulling him faster toward the pale figure in the mist. Angus's grip slipped, and Ewan's terrified face disappeared into the swirling fog, the clinking of chains fading into the distance. Angus fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands shaking violently. Ewan's screams still echoed in his ears, but now, the world was silent once more. The mist closed in around him, thick and suffocating, as if the highlands themselves were swallowing him whole. For a long moment, Angus couldn't move. His body felt frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what had just happened. He had failed. He had let Ewan be taken. The clinking of chains echoed faintly from the mist, but this time, it was moving away. The creature was retreating, dragging its victim with it, back into the darkness from which it had come. Angus staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked back toward the village, just a few hundred feet away. The lights flickered in the distance, so close, but now they felt unreachable, as if they belonged to another world entirely. He was alone. The wind picked up again, cold and biting, carrying with it the scent of earth and death. Angus looked back at the mist, where Ewan had vanished, and the terrible truth settled over him like a weight he couldn't bear. The creature had taken Duncan. And now it had taken Ewan. And it wasn't finished yet. Angus stood alone on the ridge, the wind howling around him like a distant lament, carrying with it the faint echo of chains rattling through the mist. His body trembled, not just from the cold but from the shock of everything he had witnessed. Duncan was gone. Ewan, too. And now, the thing that had hunted them, that pale, twisted figure, was retreating back into the darkness of the highlands. But it wasn't over. Angus's breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes fixed on the thickening mist that swirled like a living thing in the valley below. He could still hear the faint clinking of chains, growing distant but not gone. It was heading back to the mine, dragging Ewan, and perhaps Duncan's body, with it. The thought filled Angus with a cold dread, but deeper than that was something else. Anger. He had barely survived the mine, watched his friends be taken by something that shouldn't exist, something that haunted the earth like an ancient predator. And now it was leaving, disappearing back into the depths, as if their lives meant nothing. Angus couldn't let it end like this. Without fully realizing it, he found himself moving. His legs, shaky and weak, carried him down the hill, back toward the dark entrance of Glenmore Mine. The mist seemed to thicken as he approached, and the air grew colder, biting at his skin. But Angus didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to know what lay at the heart of this nightmare. He had to face it. The entrance of the mine loomed ahead, a black void cut into the side of the earth. The jagged stone walls and rotted wooden beams were barely visible through the swirling fog, and every instinct in Angus's body screamed for him to turn back, to run and never look behind him. But he kept moving. The wind howled through the mine's mouth as Angus stepped inside, the air immediately growing colder, the darkness swallowing him whole. His flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the tunnel, the beam bouncing off the wet stone walls. The smell of damp earth and decay filled his nostrils, a sharp reminder of the danger he was walking into. The faint sound of the creature's chains echoed from somewhere far ahead, but now it was muffled, as though the mine itself was trying to keep its secrets buried deep within. Angus followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest, every footstep echoing in the claustrophobic tunnel. The light from the outside world faded behind him, until there was only the narrow beam of his flashlight guiding him deeper into the mine. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. Angus stumbled, catching himself just before he fell into a small crevice that had opened in the floor. The tunnel here was even more unstable than before, the walls crumbling, the air thick with dust and moisture. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He followed the tunnel as it twisted and turned, leading him further into the earth. The air grew colder still, and the sound of the chains became clearer, louder. Angus's flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker, and his breath came in shallow gasps, the oppressive weight of the mine pressing down on him. And then, he heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat, but it was there, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves. Angus stopped, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he strained to hear. "Help, me!" It was Ewan's voice. Angus's heart leapt into his throat. "Ewan," he called out, his voice echoing through the tunnel. "Ewan, I'm here." "Where are you?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice came again, weaker this time, but unmistakable. "Angus, it's got me, help!" Angus broke into a run, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted down the narrow tunnel, the sound of chains growing louder with each step. The air was freezing now, every breath burning in his lungs. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, the beam of his flashlight flickering over the wet stone floor. And there, at the end of the tunnel, was Ewan. He was lying on the ground, his body limp, half submerged in the black water of the underground river. His legs were bound in the same rusted chains Angus had seen before, the metal links biting into his skin, leaving deep, bloody marks. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, his breath shallow. Angus rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Ewan. "I'm here, mate," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm going to get you out of this." Ewan's eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment, Angus saw something in them, a flicker of hope, or maybe fear. But then, as Angus reached for the chains, a sound froze him in place. The clinking of chains. But it wasn't coming from Ewan. It was coming from the tunnel behind him. Slowly, Angus turned, his flashlight sweeping over the dark, wet stone. And there, standing at the edge of the light, was the creature. It was closer now, its pale skin glistening in the darkness, its elongated limbs twisted and unnatural. The chains that draped from its body rattled softly as it moved, its glowing eyes fixed on Angus. There was no mistaking the malice in its gaze, the hunger that burned behind those hollow, unnatural eyes. Angus's blood ran cold, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. He stood slowly, positioning himself between Ewan and the creature. "You're not taking him," he growled, his voice low and filled with a fury he hadn't known he possessed. The creature's head tilted slightly, as if it were considering him, its chains rattling softly. And then, it moved. It lunged forward, faster than Angus could have imagined, the chains whipping through the air with a terrible, metallic sound. Angus barely had time to react. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. The chains clattered against the stone where he had been standing, the force of the blow shaking the tunnel. Angus scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed a broken pickaxe from the ground, its metal rusted but still sharp enough to serve as a weapon. The creature turned toward him, its chains dragging across the floor as it advanced, slow and deliberate, as if it knew there was no escape. But Angus didn't run. He stood his ground, gripping the pickaxe tightly in his hands, his eyes locked on the creature. "Come on," he muttered, more to himself than to the monster. "I'm not afraid of you." The creature lunged again, its chains snapping through the air. This time, Angus was ready. He swung the pickaxe with all his strength, the rusted blade slicing through the air. It connected with the creature's chains, sending a jarring shock through his arms. The creature howled, a terrible, inhuman sound that reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the very ground beneath them. But Angus didn't stop. He swung again, and again, each blow landing with brutal force, until finally, one of the chains snapped, clattering to the ground with a deafening crash. The creature reeled back, its glowing eyes flashing with fury. For the first time, Angus saw something in its gaze that wasn't malice. It was pain. Fear. And in that moment, Angus knew he had a chance. He charged forward, swinging the pickaxe with everything he had. The creature howled again, its body writhing as the pickaxe struck home, burying itself deep in the chains that bound its form. The metal link shattered, and with a final, ear-piercing shriek, the creature collapsed, its body crumpling to the ground in a twisted heap. For a long moment, Angus stood there, gasping for breath, his hands shaking as he stared at the motionless form of the creature. The chains were broken. The creature was gone. It was over. Angus dropped the pickaxe, the sound of it clattering against the stone echoing through the tunnel. He turned back to Ewan, who lay still on the ground, his breathing shallow but steady. "It's done," Angus whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're getting out of here." He knelt down and lifted Ewan into his arms, the weight of his friend heavier than he remembered. But Angus didn't care. He had survived the mine. He had faced the creature. And now, he was going to get them both out of there. As he made his way back through the twisting tunnels, the faint clinking of chains faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. But Angus knew he would never forget the sound. What began as a simple search for treasure uncovered an unspeakable horror. Not everyone escaped the creature lurking deep in the mine. But is the danger truly over? Or does something still wait in the shadows, ready to claim more victims? If you enjoyed this suspenseful and terrifying story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with your friends. Now we want to know, what was your favorite part of the video? Drop a comment below and let us know.